Hello, my name is Mayanka. I am accounts and a finance trainer from Uplatz. Today in this class, we will discuss the residential status concept which are related to the firm, AOP, BOI and a company. The residential status of the individual we have discussed in our previous class, in which we have discussed that the residential status of the individual is divided into three parts: resident, deemed resident and the non-resident. And the resident is further classified into two parts: resident and ordinary resident, and resident and non-ordinary resident. And we have also discussed the provision how we will determine whether such individual or such HUF is resident or not resident or non-resident. And we have also discussed some exception. As well as we have also understand the person who will be considered as resident and ordinary resident, and who will be considered the resident and not ordinarily resident. So, in our part 1 or in our previous class, we have full covered the residential status of the individual and of the HUF. Now, in this class, we will discuss the residential status. Now, in this class, we will discuss the residential status of company, AOP, BOI, any firm, whether it is LLP firm, whether LLP or whether it is a partnership firm. So now we will start our discussion on the residential status of AOP, BOI, firm and company. First, we will discuss the residential status of HUF. First, we will discuss the residential status of HUF. So the HUF the HUF will be considered, or it will be considered as a resident in India if the control and the management of such HUF is situated wholly or partly in India. Is that if the control and the management of its affairs is situated wholly in India or partly in India, then it will be considered that such HUF is resident in India. It will be a resident in India. Is that there is a HUF, Ram HUF. It is a HUF. And the control of the affairs of such HUF is in totally in India, mean wholly in India, then it will be considered that such HUF is a resident of India. Is a resident of India. Is that if the control and the management, of its affairs, if the control and the management of the HUF, if the control and the management of the affairs of the management of the HUF, if the control and the management of the affairs of such HUF is in India, it is in India, then it will be considered that such HUF is a resident. Such HUF is a resident of India. It is a resident of India if the control and the management is wholly, if control and the management of the affairs of the HUF is wholly outside India. If it is wholly outside India, then it will be considered that such HUF is not resident. It is non-resident. For the example, there is a HUF, and the management and the control of such HUF is partly the control and the management of the affairs affairs of such HUF is partly sorry, partly in India. Partly is in India. Partly is in India. Then it will be considered such HUF is a resident of India. Means such HUF is a resident of India if the management and the control of the affairs of such HUF, whether wholly or partly. If it is partly, then it will also be considered that the HUF is a resident of India. The HUF is a resident of India. If the management and the control of the affairs of such HUF is wholly in outside India, in outside India, it is outside India, then the HUF is a non-resident. Then the HUF is a non-resident, means it will be considered as it is the non-resident if the control and the management of the HUF, of the affairs of the HUF is wholly in India, means totally in India or partly in India. Totally in India or partly in India, then it will be considered as the HUF is a resident. But if the control and the management of the affairs of such HUF is totally outside India, then it will be considered as non-resident. Then such HUF will be considered as non-resident. Next example, if the management, for the example, if the management and the control of the affairs of such HUF is partly in India and partly in outside India, partly in India and partly in outside India. So in this situation, what will be the status? What will be the status of such HUF? So in this situation, the HUF will be considered as resident of India. It will be considered as a resident of India because if a whole or the part of the affairs, whole or any part of the affairs of such HUF is controlled or managed in India, managed or controlled in India, then such HUF will be considered as a resident. It will be considered as resident of India. If whole or any part of such HUF, any part of such affairs is situated wholly or partly in India, then it will be considered as resident. If wholly or totally in outside India, then it will be considered as non-resident. Ordinarily resident and not ordinary resident is that the HUF is a resident. Now, how we will determine whether it is a resident and ordinarily resident or resident but not ordinarily resident, So, if the Karta of such HUF satisfy both the additional condition, is that the condition which are required to be followed by the individual, means on the basis of which we have determined whether such individual is not ordinary resident or the ordinary resident. If the Karta of such HUF is satisfy these conditions, then the HUF will be considered as resident and ordinary resident, and otherwise it will be considered as resident but not ordinary resident. Is that if just like if there is a HUF, the HUF, and in such HUF, Mr. A, he is the Karta. And the Karta is a resident. And and ordinary resident. He is a resident as well as ordinary resident. Then the HUF will be considered as resident and ordinary resident. And ordinary resident means on the basis of status of Karta, we will determine whether the HUF is resident or ordinary resident or non-ordinary resident. If another example, Mr. B, he is the Karta of HUF and he is a resident. But not ordinary resident. In this situation, the HUF will be considered as resident, but not ordinarily resident. Means it will be considered as a resident but not ordinary resident. Means if the Karta of the HUF is a resident and ordinary resident, then the HUF will be determined or will be considered as ordinary resident. If the Karta of the HUF is a non-ordinary resident, then the HUF will also be considered as non-ordinary resident. So in the case of HUF, first we will determine whether the HUF is a resident or non-resident. To determine the resident or non-ordinary resident, we will determine whether the control and the management of the affairs of such HUF is situated in India. If it is situated partly in India or wholly in India, then such HUF will be considered as a resident of India. If the management and the control of the affairs of such HUF is situated wholly outside India, then such a HUF will be considered as a non-resident. First, we have determined the residential status of the HUF. Now we will determine whether it is a ordinarily resident or not ordinarily resident. So it will be depend upon Karta. If the Karta satisfy the conditions of ordinarily resident, then the HUF will also be considered as ordinarily resident. If the Karta does not if the Karta does not satisfy the conditions which are relating to the ordinarily resident, then the HUF will also be considered as not ordinarily resident. So this is the residential status of HUF. The Karta of resident HUF should be resident in at least 2 previous years out of 10 previous years immediately preceding the relevant previous year. Is that the Karta of such HUF, he should be the resident at least 2 previous years out of 10 previous years immediately preceding relevant previous year. Means he should be the resident of India in 2 years out of 10 previous year. The Karta should be the resident of India. And number 2, stay of Karta during 7 years immediately preceding relevant previous year should be 730 days or more. Means he stay in India for the period of 730 days or more than 730 days in just the preceding 7 years. In just the preceding 7 years, is that if these 2 conditions are satisfied, then then the Karta will be considered as ordinary resident, as well as the HUF will also be considered as ordinary resident. Is that if the Karta is a resident in India for the period of 2 years, for the period of 2 previous years, out of 10 previous year, then he will be considered as resident, ordinary resident, as well as the HUF will also be considered as ordinary resident. And if the Karta stay in India for the period of 730 days or more than 730 days in just preceding seven relevant previous years. If he is in India for 730 days or more than 730 days in just the preceding 7 years, then he will be considered as then the Karta will be considered as ordinary resident, as well as the HUF will be considered as ordinary resident. Is that if the Karta of such a resident HUF satisfy both the condition in addition to those conditions which are applicable for the individual, means such Karta is required to satisfy the condition which are given in individual section to become a ordinary resident. There are some condition, as well as he is also required, means the Karta is also required to additional condition. This one, if these additional conditions are also satisfied the such Karta, then the Karta as well as HUF, then the Karta as well as HUF both will be considered as ordinary resident. Now we will discuss a example, and on the basis of such example we will understand the residential status of HUF. The business of a HUF is transacted from Australia, and all the policy decisions are taken there. Means the business of the HUF is conducted from the Australia, and all the decisions, means all the controls, all the management of such HUF are taken from Australia. Mr. E, the Karta of HUF, who was born in Kolkata, visit India during the previous year 2020 and 21. After 15 years, he comes in India on 1st April 2020 and leaves for Australia on 1st December 2020. So determine the residential status of E and the HUF for the assessment year 21 and 22. So first we will discuss the residential status of Mr. E. So Mr. E, he comes in India. He comes in India on 1st 4 2020 and leaves India on 1st December 2020. Means he stay in India for the period of April, May, June, July, August, September, October and November. 245 days means 245 days means one day of December, first day of December. For 245 days, Mr. E, he comes in India on 1st April 2020 and he leaves India on 1st December 2020. Means he stay in India for the period of 245 days. Means he stay in India for the period more than 182 days. He stay in India for the period more than 182 days in the relevant previous year. Then he will be considered as resident of India. He will be considered as a resident of India because he stay in India for the period more than 182 days is that if there is any person who is staying in India for the period of 182 days or more than 182 days, then he will become or he will be considered as person resident of India for such a relevant previous year. So in this, according to this, Mr. E, he is staying in India for the period of 245 days, which is more than 182 days. 182 days, then he will be considered as a person resident of India. Person resident of India. Now he is a resident of India. He is a resident of India, and he comes to India after 15 years. After 15 years means he comes in India after the period of 15 years. Then he is resident. He is resident of India, but not ordinary resident of India, because he comes in India after the period of 15 years. After the period of 15 years, so he will be considered as a resident of India, but not ordinary resident of India. He will not be considered as ordinarily resident of India. He is a resident of India, but he is a not ordinarily resident of India. So this is the status of Mr. E. Next, we will determine the status of HUF. The business of the HUF is transacted from Australia, and all the decision, all the policy are taken there. Means all the business activity, all the management, all the business activity and all the management or all the work performed from Australia. Is that there is the HUF. Management means all the work and decisions are taken from the Australia. Means outside India. From outside India. Is that it will be considered as if the control and the management of the affairs of any HUF is situated outside India. If it is situated wholly outside India, then it will be considered as non-resident. So in this situation, the control and the management of such HUF is situated totally in India, totally in Australia, totally outside India. Then it will be considered as non-resident. Such HUF will be considered as non-resident. So the business of HUF is transacted from Australia, and the policy decisions are taken there. So it is assumed that the control and the management of such HUF is in Australia. It is totally and wholly outside India. So in this situation, the HUF will be considered as non-resident. It will be considered as non-resident for the previous year 20 and 21. Such HUF will be considered as non-resident, and Mr. E will be considered as resident but not ordinary resident. So on the basis of such example, we have understood how we will determine the residential status of a HUF. So residential status of HUF, if the control management is totally in India or partly in India. If the control and the management of the HUF is totally in India or it is partly in India, then it will be considered as resident of, then the HUF will be considered as a resident of India. And if the Karta of such HUF is ordinarily resident of India, then the HUF will also consider as ordinarily resident of India. then the HUF will also consider as ordinary resident of India. If the Karta of such HUF is not ordinary resident of India, then such HUF will also consider as non-ordinary resident of India. Non-ordinary resident of India. If the management and the control, if the management and the control of such HUF, if the management and the control of such HUF is situated wholly outside India, then such HUF will be considered as non-resident. If the control and the management, if the control and the management of such HUF is situated outside India, then it will be considered as such HUF is non-resident. Such HUF will be considered as non-resident. Now we will discuss residential status of firm, residential status of AOP and BOI. Residential status of firm. Firm may be LLP or it may be partnership. AOP and BOI. Residential status of firm, AOP and BOI. If the management and the control, of the AOP and BOI or the fund is wholly outside India. If it is wholly outside India, then it will be considered as non-resident. If control and management of such a firm, of such AOP, BOI is in India, if it is in India or partly in India, then it will be considered as resident of India. Is that in the case of AOP, BOI and firm, control and management is wholly and partly in India, it will be considered as resident. It will be considered as resident of India. Okay. And control and management is wholly, if it is wholly in outside India, then it will be considered as non-resident of India. Resident, a firm, AOP and BOI would be considered as resident only if the management and the control of the affairs is situated wholly or partly in India. If the control and the management of any firm, of any AOP or any BOI is situated in wholly or partly in India, then it will be considered as resident of India. If the control and the management of the affairs is situated wholly outside India, then the firm, AOP and BOI will be considered as non-resident. It will be considered as non-resident. For the example, there is a partnership firm. There is a partnership firm, and all the control and decisions are taken from USA. It is taken from USA. Then it will be considered as the control and the management of such firm is outside India. The control and the management of such firm, of such LLP is, of such partnership firm is outside India, then such firm will be considered as non-resident of India. Such firm will be considered as non-resident of India because all the control and all the management are wholly outside India, then it will be considered as non-resident of India. Next example, if there is a AOP and Partly management is from India and partly from USA. Then it will be considered that the control and the management is partly from India and partly from outside India, partly from India and partly from outside India. Then it will be considered as resident of India. Then such AOP will be considered as resident of India. So if the management and the control of the affairs of such AOP, BOI and the HUF is wholly or partly in India, then it will be considered as resident of India. If it is wholly outside India, then it will be considered as non-resident of India. Non-resident of India. Now we will discuss the residential status of company. Residential status of the company. So, in the case of company, the companies are divided into two parts. In the case of company, the companies are divided into two parts. Means there are two types of company. Number one is Indian company and number two is foreign company. Number one is Indian company and number two is a foreign company. A company will be considered as resident of India in the previous year if the company will be considered the resident of such India only if number one it is an Indian company. If it is an Indian company, is that the foreign company will never be the resident of India. A foreign company will not be, it will never be a resident of India. So when there is any company is an Indian company and the place of effective management of such company is in India. The place of effective management of such company is in India, then such company will be considered as resident in India. If means a company would be considered as a resident in India in any previous year if it is an Indian company, if it is an Indian company. First condition is that it is an Indian company, and number two is place of effective, the place of effective business, place of effective management of such company is in India, then such if these two conditions are satisfied, then the company will be considered as resident. Then it will be considered as resident of India. For the example, there is a company ABC. There is a company ABC and it is registered as Indian company. It is registered as an Indian company. And the place of effective management of such company is in UK. It is in UK. So in this situation, such company will be considered as, in this situation, the company will be considered as non-resident of India, because the place of effective management of such company is outside India. It is outside India, then it will be considered as non-resident of India. Then such company will be known as non-resident of India. So the company should be an Indian company, and number two, the place of management of such companies should be in India. It should be in India. Then it will be considered as resident. It will be considered as resident in India. Then such company will be resident in India if these two conditions are satisfied. So the place of effective management means the key management and the commercial decision. The key management and the commercial decision that all are very much necessary to conduct the business is that the decisions which are relating to the management and which are relating to the activities or the business of the entity. When all the decisions which are relating to the management, relating to the commercial, that all are necessary to conduct the business or to conduct the business transaction of the entity is substance meet. It is substance means the place where these transactions, these decisions are taken, then such place will be known as place of effective management. Place of effective management. And on the basis of place of effective management, the residential status of the company is decided. If the place of effective management is in India and the company is an Indian company, then it will be considered as the company is a resident in India. If the place of effective management is outside India and the company is an Indian company, then it will be considered as the company is a non-resident in India. If the company is a foreign company and the place of effective management is in India, then it will be considered that the company is a non-resident. The company is a non-resident. So, determination of residential status of the company, determination of the residential status of company. Now, on the basis of such flowchart, we will discuss whether the company is a resident of India, whether the company is a non-resident of India. Means on the basis of such flowchart, we will discuss the residential status of the company. Residential status of the company. Number one. First question. Is the company an Indian company? Whether the company is an Indian company? If the answer is yes, the company is a resident of India. If the answer is yes, then the next question will be whether the principal place of the principal place of management of such company is in India. If the answer is yes, then such company is a resident of India. Then such company is resident of India. If if the answer of the question whether the company is an Indian company is no, and the principal place of or the place of such a management of such company is outside India, the answer is no. In this situation, such company will be considered as non-resident. The company will be considered as non-resident. Is that to become a resident of India, the company will satisfy these two conditions. These two conditions are properly satisfied by such company. If these conditions are satisfied, then such company will be considered as resident of India. Then such company will be considered as resident of India. Otherwise, it will not be considered as resident. It will be considered as non-resident of India. It will be considered as non-resident of India. So this is the residential status of the company. This is the residential status of company. Now we will discuss the residential status of the local authority and the artificial judicial person. Now we will discuss the residential status of local authority. Residential status of local authority and the artificial judicial person. Artificial judicial person. So in the case of local authority and in the case of artificial judicial person, if the management and the control of the affairs is situated wholly or partly in India, if the management and the control of affairs of these local authority of this artificial judicial person is in India, wholly or partly, whether wholly or partly, then it will be considered as resident of India. Otherwise, it will be considered as non-resident of India. Is that if the control and the management of such AOP and BOI is in outside India, then it will become non-resident of India. Means there is a AOP and BOI. There is a local authority. There is the local authority. And such a local authority, in the case of local authority, control and management. Control and management is in India, is in India, then it will be considered as a resident of India, whether wholly or partly, whether wholly or partly. And control and management is in outside India, wholly in outside India, wholly in outside India, then it will be considered as non-resident of India. Then it will be considered as non-resident of India. Where the control and the management of the affairs is situated wholly outside India, then it will become non-resident. It will become non-resident. So, on the basis of such discussion, we have understand the residential status of the AOP, BOI, partnership firm, company, local authority, and artificial judicial person. Normally, in the case of any AOP, BOI, in the case of partnership firm, in the case of local authority and artificial judicial person, if the management and the control of the affairs of such an entity is in wholly or partly in India, then it will be considered as resident of India. And if it is in outside India, management and the control of the affairs is outside India, then it will be considered as non-resident. In the case of company, it should be an Indian company, and the place of effective management should also be in India. Then it will be considered as resident of India. It will be considered as resident of India. So on the basis of such concept, first we will determine the residential status of the entity. Then after we will determine the taxable income and the tax liability of the person. So before calculation or before determining the amount which would be taxable in the hands of assessee, first we will determine the residential status of the person. So thank you so much for watching this video. Kindly consider previous video of such topic also, so that you can properly understand such concept. Thank you so much. Bye bye and bye bye.